Hello, fellow birders. My name is Denis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at how to attract hummingbirds to your backyard. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird related. And as I mentioned, today we'll be talking about how to attract hummingbirds to your yard. So some of the things I'm hoping to cover today is a world perspective on hummingbird distribution, the Midwest hummingbird that you're likely to see in your backyard, how to attract hummingbirds to your backyard, food sources for hummingbirds, some favored plants of the hummingbirds, mixing your own hummingbird nectar, cleaning your hummingbird feeder, hummingbird mortality, and ruby-throated hummingbird courtship and nesting. So first of all, I'd like you to think about just the fact that hummingbirds are very, very diverse, and through the Western Hemisphere, they are spread far and wide. And people have always revered hummingbirds as just very, very interesting creatures. And you can tell that just by some of the names that they get that we do hold them in high regard. We have crowned wood nymph and empress brilliant and rufous crested coquettes. Many of our hummingbirds have the word star in them, like buff-winged star frontlet, or you'll have wood stars or star throats. They're just always very exciting names with all of them. Sparkling violet ear is another one that I really enjoy. So looking across the Western Hemisphere, we can see that the distribution is spread from the very, very north up here in Alaska, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego here, down in Argentina and Chile. And when you get to those extremes, you only have one hummingbird species that's around. But if you go to the center of the hummingbird universe, which is found in Ecuador, where the spine of the Andes intersects with the equator, you have a small country about the size of Colorado that has over 160 species of hummingbirds. And as you disperse from those, that intersection, the number of hummingbird species starts to decline. As I said, when you get all the way up into the far north here in Alaska, you have one species, and when you get all the way down here to the southern tip of South America, you have only one species. And hummingbirds are found only in the Western Hemisphere. They're not in Australia or Asia or Europe or Africa. They're just found here in North America, Central America, and South America. And over that whole geographic region, there are about 340 species of hummingbirds that are recognized in the world. When you get to the United States, we have about 16 species of hummingbirds. And in the eastern half of the United States, we basically have only one that is a regular visitor and breeder. We do have a couple others that will show up on occasion, but the hummingbird that you can expect to see would be the ruby-throated hummingbird. So that's unfortunate, since I enjoy hummingbirds so much. I have to travel very far in order to get all these other hummingbirds. So here is the ruby-throated hummingbird. This is the one that you can expect to see in your yard. You can see the range map here shows that they do cover all of the eastern half of the United States, and even getting out into the west somewhat here in Canada. And in the winter months, they're going to go all the way down to the southern coast and the southern tip of Florida, and you will find them through Central America. And I have seen them as far south as Panama, but they do not make it to South America. And this is what our male ruby-throated hummingbird looks like, and this is what the name comes from. You can see the gorget is all a ruby red color. Depending on how the light is hitting it, it'll look very, very red. When the light is not hitting it very well, and the hummingbird has some control over that and how it moves itself around, that throat can look very, very black. On a female, it's going to be all very white. On a young bird, you can see some little dark spots in the throat, and that indicates that this is probably a young male. Here's the female here, and it's completely a white throat. So that's the target species for us. That's the one we're going to try and get into our backyard. And attracting hummingbirds to your backyard can be as simple as just setting up a hummingbird feeder. And you can see in the background here, I have a couple of them set up today. And sometimes that's all it takes. If the birds are in your area, they will find you. They are always searching for new food sources. So if they see a hummingbird feeder, they'll be on it pretty quickly. I've run some tests and put hummingbird feeders up in my yard, and I'll have the hummingbird at the feeder within minutes. You can also plant a lot of attractive flowers that you can enjoy, and the hummingbirds will enjoy them as well. Things that are red, like red salvia, can be a big bonus, but any kind of flower will do basically, as long as you have a lot of diversity in your yard so that there's something blooming all through the breeding season. That's a huge advantage, and you'll have hummingbirds coming to you all the time. I'd really like to see people using native plants as much as possible, and I'll have some examples for you to select from in just a minute. But the key thing is just to get some diversity and having that floral arrangement in your yard all through the breeding season. So try to select plants that will bloom at different times of the season. Water is not a key factor for hummingbirds because they do get all of their fluids through the nectar that they're drinking. So you seldom, if ever, see a hummingbird at a bird bath, taking a sip of water. They will bathe. I've never seen them in a bird bath, but I have seen them dipping into ponds down in Central America and deliberately diving into the water repeatedly and then coming out and preening. So they are definitely taking a bath. And here in my backyard, when I've been out watering my garden and I have the nozzle turned down to a finer mist, I'll actually have hummingbirds come fly up to me, and they go flying back and forth through the mist in order to get themselves wet. And on occasion, I've even seen them land on broadleaf plants, and they'll actually kind of roll themselves in the water that's droplets that have accumulated on the leaf surface. So you could add a mister to your bird bath, and that may also be a bonus, but I think that's probably not going to be as much of an attractant as the hummingbird feeder itself or the bright flowers. So if you haven't had much luck in attracting hummingbirds to your yard, you might consider trying in migration. So spring migration and fall migration, particularly fall migration when there's many more hummingbirds that are migrating through. That's a good opportunity to have them find your backyard. So hummingbirds' diet is quite varied. Of course, we all know that they're going to drink nectar from flowers. That's well known amongst most people. And I have an illustration of that here. But they're also going to eat other things. They do need protein in their diet, particularly when they're feeding young in the nest, or when they're molting and they have to generate new feathers. They need a lot more energy for that. So in this example, you can actually see that there's an insect in the bill of this hummingbird, and you can see trailing off here, you can see a little bit of spider webbing. They will approach spider webs in order to get food out of the web. It's easy pickings for them. I've also seen them hovering over plants in my yard, evergreens that have no flowers visible, and they're searching for insects. And they'll just go up and down along the outer edge of the plant in order to look for insects. I've seen them do that even to my house, the siding on the house, and they'll just be going up and down, searching every crevice and watching for insects to pick off. Another thing that they'll use is sap from a tree. And so you can see here there are some sap wells that have been drilled by a yellow-bellied sapsucker, and they'll go there for two reasons, actually to drink the sap, and also any insects that have been attracted to that sap and are trapped in there, they'll pick those off as well. And there is some correlation between, in the springtime, a correlation between the migration of yellow-bellied sapsuckers and ruby-throated hummingbirds. The leading edge of the sapsucker migration will have some impact on just how far north hummingbirds will move at a particular time in the spring. And usually they will not advance beyond where the yellow-bellied sapsuckers have already migrated, because there's a limited number of flowers available to them at that time of year, and so they do rely heavily on those sapsucker wells. I've seen them approaching trees and utilizing those wells, as well as wounds on trees, in order to get some sap. So I took a quick stroll through my backyard, and here's some of the flowers that I just happened to see when I was developing this video. And you can see that there's a variety of things, and there might be flowers that you wouldn't think of would be attracting hummingbirds. So I do have yellow honeysuckle vine, which is a native honeysuckle. It has a very ornate looking flower, and the hummingbirds seem to go wild over that. When that's blooming in my yard, I have hummingbirds all over it all the time. And a rhododendron, you might not think of that as a hummingbird attractant, but they do really like rhododendrons. Columbine, I think people think of columbines and hummingbirds in the same thought quite often. But you do get small indistinctive little flowers like on the Solomon seal here or on the dwarf honeysuckles. The dwarf honeysuckle is also a native plant in our area, so it's not one of the invasives from Asia. So you can plant this in your yard with a clear conscience. But it has very, very small flowers, but I have seen hummingbirds attracted quite a bit to these tiny flowers. And then there's things like spiderworts, which are very attractive, and we can enjoy them just as much as the hummingbirds do. The key thing is to have a lot of diversity, as I mentioned earlier. You want to have things that are blooming throughout the season so that there's always a food source in your yard, not only for hummingbirds, but for any of the other pollinators, bees and butterflies. It's all very important. So here's a little video just to show you that they will be attracted to these very, very small flowers. This is a ruby-throated, and it's going after Solomon seal blossoms that are hanging down underneath the stem. And I see that happening over and over again in my yard quite often. So here's another set of flowers that you might utilize in your landscape design. And we've got butterfly weed here, which is very attractive. Prairie blazing star, which is a nice one to have in your landscape. New Jersey tea, wild petunias, hoary vervain, and foxglove beard tongue. And all of these are readily available in your landscape stores, especially ones that have a section on native plants. Also, the DuPage County Forest Preserve will run a native plant sale in the springtime. You can watch for that on their website, and they'll have a lot of these plants available. And again, they're not only good as a food source for hummingbirds, but also for all of our other pollinators. Here's some more examples: purple coneflower, even things like palm sedge, which is Carex muskingamensis, wild bergamot. We have cardinal flower here, smooth blue aster, great blue lobelia. So again, these are things that will bloom throughout different parts of the breeding season. And here's a list of those plants and their Latin names to go along with them. So if you want to do a search for those and see if you can find them in some local stores, you can take this opportunity to hit print screen on your computer and save this page, and then you'll be able to refer to it later, and you can print it off whenever you want. So we can mix our own hummingbird food, and people generally do that. You don't have to buy it in the store. And the formula for doing that is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. And so you should have both of those materials readily available to you. This is showing measuring cups that look like a big, 1 cup amount, and you don't need anything that large, especially when you're first starting out and you don't know how many hummingbirds you're going to have attracted to your yard. Actually dole out the hummingbird food in tablespoons rather than in cups. So when I first mix up a batch in the beginning of the spring to see just how many hummingbirds will be around, I'll take 2 tablespoons of sugar and mix that with 8 tablespoons of water, and that's enough to get you started. And that'll last for 3 or 4 days, even a week, depending on how many hummingbirds you have around. You can mix in larger batches and you can store it in your refrigerator, but even in the refrigerator, it's only going to keep for about 2 weeks. So I prefer, since I have a lot of time on my hands, especially now during COVID days, I'll mix it in small quantities and just keep revisiting the feeder and seeing how the water levels are in that feeder. And when you don't put a lot in there, that means it's going to empty quicker, which means you're going to be cleaning it more frequently, and that's very important, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's best to use cane sugar. You can use beet sugar as well, but do not use any other artificial sugars. Do not use honey, and tap water is fine. And it's not necessary to boil the water. It does help in the mixing process to have it heated up, but it's not necessary. But if you do boil it, make sure that it cools down before you put it into the feeder. And it's certainly not necessary to have food coloring added. The hummingbird feeders themselves will have plenty of red on them generally, and so that's going to be the attractant. It doesn't matter what the fluid is like. You can see there's quite a diversity in hummingbird feeders, just all sorts of them on the market. What I would suggest is that you pick one out that's very easy to clean. The easier it is to clean, the more frequently you will end up cleaning it, and that's going to be very important for the health of your hummingbirds. So again, if you have 2 choices there. You can either mix it in small amounts and go out frequently, or you can mix a large batch and keep it in your refrigerator. So cleaning your hummingbird feeder is very, very important. And so again, I've selected a model, this one here, which you can actually see is hanging over my shoulder. And it opens up, this bottom plate here actually opens up, and you can see that it's easy to get to. There's a lot of nooks and crannies in there, and that's going to be the case in all hummingbird feeders. But this one opens up so that you can actually easily get to it. And I will take the hummingbird feeder apart, and I'll actually soak it in some soapy water or a mixture of bleach and water. And if you are going to use bleach, you'd want to use 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. So you soak that feeder, and then you can scrub it to make sure that you get any bacterial buildup that's on there out of there. If anywhere you see any discoloring on the feeder, that's something that you should target, and you should rinse to get all that off. So rinse it again in cold water when you're done, and then let it air dry. I usually will do it like a triple rinse on everything, so that even once it dry or is in the drying process, by then you should have removed just about any kind of soapy material or bleach. And again, just let it air dry. So by triple rinsing it, I mean, you know, I'll take the reservoir here and actually, you know, fill that up 3 times, spilling it out in between, and doing the same practice with all of the other parts as well. So this may sound like a lot of work in order to get your hummingbird feeder clean, but it's very important. And so, you know, if this does sound like a lot of work to you, then, you know, maybe you shouldn't be trying to feed hummingbirds. Let's talk a little bit about hummingbird mortality. Probably one of the biggest things to worry about is the cleanliness of your hummingbird feeder, because that bacteria can kill your hummingbirds, and we certainly don't want to do that. Another big issue that can come up is spider webs, and I'm not suggesting to remove the spider webs. I'm just telling you that it is a danger to the hummingbirds. They will use that spider web as a food source. They go after it to, you know, pick out insects, and they also will use that material in their nest building, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So hummingbirds do frequent spider webs, but, you know, they can have an opportunity where they'll get trapped in that web, and once they're in there, they have a very difficult time getting out. Another problem that you might not think could possibly be a big issue is to leave your porch open or your garage open. And hummingbirds will get in there and they get disoriented, and even though there's this gaping hole where the garage door is, they manage to not find their way out. They get trapped in there. If you do encounter a situation like that, the best thing to do is to actually get a hummingbird feeder, set it up, and because this bird is going to be starving for food, it will go to that feeder. And then you can just slowly move the feeder with each visit, move it a little further towards the door, and eventually it will find its way out. So that's a lot easier and less opportunity to damage the hummingbird than if you were to try and actually capture it with a net or with your hands. Hummingbirds can even get caught on things like burdock. And, you know, if they get too close as they're looking for insects, they can get those little barbules into their feathers, and once those hook on, they really have hardly any opportunity to push themselves off. So they're going to be trapped there. And I have found birds, even larger birds like kinglets, and I've even found small bats in this kind of a predicament. So it seems something that's very unlikely to happen, but it does happen. I have not witnessed this myself, but I've seen plenty of pictures on the internet showing that praying mantises will go out onto feeders or plant vegetation where there's a lot of flowers, and they will actually try to ambush the hummingbirds. And I have seen pictures, which I didn't include here, of praying mantises actually with hummingbirds captured. Snakes will attempt the same mode of attack, and they'll hide themselves by the feeder or around flowering plants with the hopes of hummingbirds arriving and them striking at them. Window strikes are a big danger to all birds, including hummingbirds. And another thing to think about is those pesticides that you might be using in your yard. Pesticides are very harmful in 2 ways. First of all, if you're using an insecticide, you'll be eliminating an important food source for the hummingbird. And also, if they do get those insects that have been sprayed, that chemical will be concentrating as it moves up the food chain. So the hummingbird is going to be the top of that food chain, and it's going to perish once those chemicals reach a high level concentration in their system. On a happier note, the ruby-throated hummingbird courtship and nesting is quite interesting. In most cases, almost all cases of hummingbird species, the male is there to set up a territory, and it's going to attract females, and it's going to mate, and then its job is done. It does all that heavy lifting, and then after that, it's up to the female to do the rest of the work. And she'll build a nest by herself. She will incubate the eggs by herself. She will feed the young all by herself. So it's a pretty tough living. But the ruby-throated hummingbird will stake out a territory. It may include your backyard, and it's going to go for an area that is very rich in food sources. And the strongest males, the best males, are going to be able to hang on to those best territories. And so the females are looking for that as a signal that they are mating with a very good male. And so that territory that it protects is very important. And it does require a lot of work because there is a lot of competition. Males will also do a courtship flight, and I have seen this on occasion. It's a very elliptical flight pattern, and they'll just kind of look like they're swooping down and shooting back up into the air, and they'll repeatedly do that. And if you look around, you'll probably find that there's a female nearby that's watching that courtship display. It's quite impressive to see this flight pattern. So as I mentioned, after the mating, the female will she'll stay in the territory, and she'll assume all breeding responsibilities or brooding responsibilities from that point forward. The nests are extremely small. I hardly ever come across them. They're just barely big enough to hold those 2 eggs, and the female can kind of tuck herself in there and incubate the eggs. The nest itself is made up of a lot of fine material. I mentioned that spider webbing is very important to the hummingbirds, and they will use that to hold all these other materials together. And what that allows is for the nest to grow or to expand as the hummingbird chicks are growing. So what you start out with a very small nest, and it can enlarge to some extent so that it will hold those chicks. The inside of the nest will have very, very fluffy material in it. I've seen hummingbirds collecting cattail fluff and using that in their nests. And then the exterior will have a lot of lichens pasted to it with saliva, or using that spider webbing, and that's for camouflage purposes. And I guess that's why we don't see them very often. So while all this is going on, the male is attempting to attract another female to that same territory, and the cycle continues. So later in the season, you'll have many more hummingbirds around. If these hummingbirds are successful in raising young, you're going to have a lot more little hummingbirds at your feeders. And those hummingbirds that you will see that are the first-year birds, they're going to be just as large as the adult birds. Typically in birds, when a bird fledges from the nest, it's usually already at near adult size. So you won't be able to distinguish them from the adults. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.